Hey guys, this is going to be a quick video on distribution. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can, but I like to refer to this as the monster underneath your model because oftentimes it's overlooked by artists. Now, this will apply, of course, to 3D models you might be designing or creating, but it also applies to 2D artworks and graphic design and things like that as well. Now, if you want to think of a dice, usually they have these little dots on it, right? And these dots represent the numbers, of course, for the dice, but they're arranged in a particular little manner. And you want to think about distribution as points. This is going to help you out quite a bit. You guys that worked with geometry nodes in Blender will understand this, but you can think of them as dots as well as overall shapes and a number of different things, anyways. So you'll often see in videos, tutorials on distribution, they'll talk about placement of things, right? And how much space one thing might occupy over another. And that's a great way to look at it. But what we're looking at here is in reality something similar that I showed in previous videos where we talk about kind of the breakup of an edge, perhaps, where if you break it into quarters, you'll know you'll have 0, 25, 50%, 75%, and 100%. But you can, of course, break up an edge at different ratios like 30%, 10%, and so on and so forth. And so, uh, what this means, though, is that when you're looking at a shape or a form overall, you're looking at kind of these little grid patterns, perhaps, or these cross sections at these different uh, numbers here. So, if this was broken into thirds, this would be like 33%. It's 66.6666. You get the idea. Um, we're looking at these little dots here that these little vertices where they cross sections are perhaps. Now these exist everywhere, and they also exist where you might break something in half. And so you want to start looking at everything you're creating in this kind of a manner, perhaps. Now distribution isn't just only that though. You could think of like any 3D geometry, or let's think of like curves in like a 2D software, like you're doing graphic design. You might have like points for the you might have vertices for the little points here on like a hexagon, but you could put points infinitely anywhere in this area, right? And so how you arrange that is the distribution, right? So you could think like, you do one and then you do a big gap and then you do little gap and then you do big gap, little gap, and so on and so forth. So um, it's kind of interesting, right? Like the dots are starting to all line up with each other. But when you start breaking down your reference images, right? What you're quickly going to see or discover or find is when you're looking at any kind of object that you're trying to create, a lot of times like hard surface shapes, things like that, you'll find that it has a lot of nuts and bolts and rivets and things on it. And they're arranged in kind of particular little manners. So do check out your reference images and look for that kind of thing occurring or happening where they're arranged in just different little peculiar manners like this. Okay. And so what does this mean? Like, what are we getting to here? Basically, where any dot of information exists, you can think of this as like the center point of an object or a shape. Okay. And so, well, when we line up on an edge, perhaps we have center alignment, we have left alignment, perhaps, or right alignment. Okay. We could do that at any time, but we could place things off to the side as well. Okay. Or if we have like a cross section, we can place them in corners like that. Okay. And so we're going to do kind of a similar thing with these dots of information. And so this is just something you can do that's quite effective. Now, the distribution can be a pattern. Okay. So if you had, dot, 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 you had dot, 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 like so, a lot of you guys recognize this pattern. It's also another pattern if you didn't realize it. Think of these as like the center of a square, right? And so instantly, this is an offset pattern, same thing that you would have with a brick pattern, right? So pay attention to this stuff over and over and over again, and you'll find that you can make some pretty interesting things with patterns and distribution. Okay. So, for example, if this was big circles at the bottom, right, and we changed it to the top to be little circles, it'd be a little bit more interesting than just leaving it one size all the way through, right? So we can replace the dots with objects at different sizes. Okay. And so that's where it becomes fun because now you can say you want dot, 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 and then maybe two dots. Okay. And so you can, of course, draw little rectangles on these things or squares. And on these ones, maybe they're circles. All right. So we can start replacing things as well. But let's take this one, for example. If we have dots like this, okay, we put like a big circle here and a big circle here, okay? And the rest of these were small circles. Okay, it's kind of an interesting, it's pleasing kind of a layout there. So We could do something like that perhaps, but let's take that same setup. Let's vary it a little. So instead of doing the big ones down here, maybe we have big ones only here and here, right? And the rest of these remain small. Okay. So you see how we get kind of a different layout here, a different kind of setup just by varying the sizes of things. You're going to want to keep this in mind as you're working on things, because that's pretty much more or less what you're going to be doing as you play around with distribution. Now, here's another thing I want to talk about. So there's positive and negative space. And so when you do shape breakups, a lot of you guys are already kind of playing with this idea. You do a shape breakup, you cut something in half and cut the half in half and leave the other one the same the way it is. But you a lot of times there's like positive and negative space. You can think of black as being like pushed in maybe, and then positive being like panels, and this is like a cupboard or something. So if you're designing cabinetry, this might be something you end up doing, something like that, right? And so a lot of people like to refer to this and they want to say like, how much is this space occupying, right? So like we know this was 50%, this is 25, so this is 25% negative space, right? And so that's another way you can think about distribution as well, and positives and negatives. You want to know how much space a shape might occupy that can exist on anything. So you could be like, how much space is this occupying? That shape, anyways. So that's part of distribution. Now, when you start comboing all this stuff together, you have any kind of shape that you create, right? You can start putting points throughout it, basically. And you'll notice that we're starting to do alignments as well at the same time if we're thinking about it in that manner. So maybe we keep this parallel here and we have points here, 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 and so on and so forth throughout this whole thing, right? We could put midpoints. We can do maybe like a mirrored version of this, but push it in a little bit and do something like that, right? So we're starting to break things up in these little dot kind of setups here, but erase the lines. All right. So this is just a little exercise you can practice with. You can start erasing lines. You're going to find that you can generate kind of interesting ideas by not focusing on the lines at a certain point because you'll have a bunch of points to play with, right? And so let me just go ahead and get that brush size up real quick so we can go through this a little faster. But we have this kind of arrangement of dots now. Okay. And so what can we do with these things? Well, you could play a little game of connect the dots, basically. So what you're looking at here is all these different little alignments, possibly. You can play connect the dots with them. And think of this being just a big shape you want to work with in that area, perhaps. You see how this starts to behave? You can create interesting little ideas just by doing that as well. And you can add additional little elements, perhaps. Like these are all moving in at this direction. It would have been nicer if this one was pointed more inwards, but basically you can think about like where the cross section is that all of these would have met up, and it would have been somewhere maybe over there like that. And so instead of putting a little dot over there, you might want to think about putting something a little bit larger, right? So put like a bigger dot perhaps. So this is how you're going to start getting some interesting ideas going anyways. It's just playing around with the points there more or less. And so, also take into consideration the positive and negative space that you're working in, right? Now you can always swap things as well. So, if you're doing a pattern like this, where you're just basically doing the same thing over and over and over again, you can vary that pattern up, no problem, right? By changing the shapes. So maybe these are all squares or circles here in the corners, but these could be maybe like triangles pointing outwards. Okay. And so this one could be pointing outwards here, and this one could be pointing outwards from that square as well. And so we can keep repeating that pattern if we wanted to, no problems. But we could also change the directions of the triangles perhaps, and that might make it look a little bit more interesting. I think just keeping them pointed away looks fine though, so we'll keep doing that. And so now we're distributing these like so, right? You could think of a curve in a graphic design program as well. You might want to distribute, maybe evenly so often, like all the way through, but you might change the shapes around. So it might be like a big, small circle, a big circle, maybe a triangle at some point, and maybe that repeats, right? So that's literally what's going on there potentially. You're doing shapes on a curve. And so that process will more than likely just keep repeating over and over and over again. But that's kind of distribution in a nutshell. It's just about how you lay out shapes or forms on another object usually. But the points themselves can be confusing. But once you realize that they're representing kind of just placement in space, I guess is the easiest way to put it. You'll see that you can do a lot of things with this because you maybe have a panel that you're doing, right? And you want to put a dot in each corner, and that might be fine, sure. But if you put a dot out towards the center as well, and then a dot in the center, you got more or less kind of that dice arrangement. It's kind of interesting. But check this out. You play connect the dots again, right? And suddenly this looks like a lot of sci-fi designs where they have those little pill shapes going out towards the center here. And what's at the center of this thing? Maybe it's just a bigger pill shape. Who knows? It could be anything really. You could put a square there. You could put a bigger pill shape or whatever the case. So this is often what you're going to do. And also, you might try to align things as well on maybe like the top or the bottom. I start doing things like that as well. So you can add additional points if needed or take points away. And that just becomes a fun thing to do. So, whenever you're creating any kind of arrangement of dots and you're making things kind of symmetrical, perhaps, right? You can see what's going on here. Just take a dot away. I was thinking of a shape like this, by the way, if you weren't recognizing it, but something more like that. Okay. And so you take the dot away, and now you have something like this. And so maybe you can think like you do something like that. And so now maybe there's a circle in there. Does that look aesthetically pleasing? Maybe in certain situations. I don't think it's that great like this, but you'll have to make judgment calls on what looks right and what works for you and what looks good and doesn't look good. So back to this guy up here, and you'll notice I've been doing that on a number of places up here. Like this is kind of like a trapezoid, right? And then this is more like a triangle with a circle at the top. But this one here is broken up. This is originally this was uh, something like this. Let's see if I can do it out here. It was something more like this that I started with, and I just doubled it up basically like this. Okay, and then eventually I erased this stuff in the middle, played connect the dots a bit, and so you can end up with some interesting designs very fast by doing this number, right? And so you can see I took that one entirely away. And so I got rid of this one, I think, and I put a circle there instead, or something like that anyway. So I think you get the idea. You can end up with some rather original looking stuff, and then just combo it up with some more shape, perhaps later on, and then do whatever you got to do there. Positive, use positive and negative space, guys. So when you're working in Blender on 3D objects, just use Boolean subtractions or use Boolean additions as well. Don't just keep going in one direction. But overall, hopefully this video helps some of you guys out. It's just kind of a different way of looking at the edge breakups, perhaps, right? Or the how to work with maybe grids a little bit differently, or even shapes in general. And so, for me, anyways, distribution is kind of interesting because it's not unfamiliar. Like when you start really thinking about it, it's a lot of stuff. Perhaps when you look at it in maybe another video or tutorial, it seems like a little bit overwhelming, but it's really not. It's just kind of a simple concept, and you have to get used to working with it though, in order to I think master it really. But anyways, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I'll check it out in the next one. All right, take care.